Welcome again, and welcome to a presentation about one of the main topics that we are actually using, that we are actually elaborating here at the Institute of Spatial Planning, Spatial Planning, Environmental Planning and Land Rearrangement that I'm heading. And this is all about integrating spatial planning and energy planning, so to plan for the energy transition. I mean, we are all aware about the crisis situations, the climate scenarios that we are in. We are all aware about the policies that we have, that are drafted at the moment or have been drafted in the last couple of years to protect our climate. And we have now seen also some impressive programs that are launched by the European Union, for instance. And the question is also, how can we bring that to practice? And all these programs won't work without spatial planning. And this is something that we have already found out a couple of years ago. And I give you one example for that. And this is, these are calculations from a tool that we have developed already around 10 years ago, the ELAS calculator. That is open access, available in the internet. You can also use it. So there's also an English version with it. And the calculator makes energy balances on a life cycle basis of settlements that includes the construction of houses, the construction of technical infrastructure, so that means the embodied energy in streets, sewer systems, and so on, of course also in houses, the energy needed for heating, for electricity, and also for the mobility of the people. So it's an overall rather holistic approach, but only for residential areas. And I've brought you two graphs. The top left corner shows a balance of a settlement with standalone single-family houses, newly built. And in such settlements, up to half of the whole energy consumption in a life cycle perspective is related to the public infrastructure, to streets, sewer systems, and so on, to their building and to their maintenance. And this is because single-family houses, standalone single-family houses, are a very inefficient form of settlements. We all know that, but calculating it in kilowatt hours and CO2 emissions makes this very, very visible and very, very understandable. If we just increase the density a bit, 3-story apartment buildings, what we see, the share of the public infrastructure comes down to 15% or less. And with 5-story buildings, of course, the share is still smaller. Of course, you always need the same amount of energy to build the street. But in the overall balance of the settlement, you see how the efficiency of a settlement increases with increasing building densities, but there are also limits for that. And in order to work on these topics, to systematically integrate that in spatial planning, planning for the energy transition, in Austria, we've developed the approach of integrated spatial and energy planning that says that this is an integral part of spatial planning. We should have to deal with it, and that we have to deal with spatial dimensions of the energy demand and spatial dimensions of the energy supply. There are different working groups, universities dealing with this topic. We had the chance to consult an intergovernmental panel that came up with this discussion, with this definition that is also present in, for instance, in the governmental programs. It is also implemented nowadays in spatial planning laws, and so it is actually coming to the ground. What I would like to show you now is how we support with our research municipalities, regions, provincial governments who are actually in charge of spatial planning in Austria. It's not a state-level activity, it's a provincial, federal, state-level activity in Austria. And how we approach this from a methodological point of view and also from a conceptual point of view to in our research and in our also third mission activities, actually. First of all, let me clarify what are the spatial dimensions of energy demand and energy supply. As there is energy efficiency on a refrigerator, for instance, we have energy efficiency in spatial structures as well. And you can identify this energy efficiency of spatial structures with a few design principles that are well known to spatial planners. By the way, not to energy planners normally. And that means that we have to have a certain mixed use of areas, mix of functions. We have to have moderate density, not too low and not too high. We should organize our settlements according to nearness. We should make them compact. And also siting plays a role in the sense that we have certain issues of exposition and of topography that should be thought about and considered in urban design. So these structures that are that can be also identified with sustainable spatial development, these structures help to save energy from a very structural perspective. When it comes to energy supply, of course, we have to secure sites for energy generation facilities, for power plants, for spin wheels, for wind power, for hydropower, for also for grids, for storage technologies, which will be more important in the energy transition, actually. We have to secure resources, because what we are doing is when we use fossil energy, to say it with ecological footprint language, we borrow land from the past. Protecting our climate, implementing the energy transition means to stop that. And it means that we create new land use demands in our present area. And these present areas, these present spatial structures are already overused. And we still have new land use demands for energy generation. And this is something that we have to think about. This will create new land use conflicts along the implementation of the energy transition. And this is what we have to think about. And then finally, what we found out is that these energy efficient spatial structures are better suited, for instance, for grid-bound energy supplies, and they are better suited to support sector coupling from a very generic perspective, and also to supply these structures with renewable energy. Just to give you one example, district heating is interesting. When you do district heating in only a residential area, you have certain peaks in the morning and in the evening when people are at home, of energy demand, for instance. But if you have same district heating in a mixed-use area, then people leave home, go to work, need energy there, go home again. So just because we have a different spatial structure, we can level out peaks of energy demand, and you don't need some sophisticated high technology steering mechanism. You just need a sufficient spatial structure for that. And I think this is something that we have to more and more think about. And this is also why we deal with one aspect very intensively in our research and in our work, is to identify and to promote these energy efficient spatial structures. And when you look at the design principle, it does mean that we find a possibility also for calculations, for quantifiable data, in order to support sustainable spatial planning. And this is what we are actually trying to do with different initiatives on different scales and levels. One of them is the energy mosaic that we started to involve with energy balances like the LS calculator that I showed you at the beginning. And Lore Abad from our institute now finalized it in a way that we can provide this as an open source data. So there are different features included. One of the nice features is this map. That's why it's called Mosaic, because it has so many it has such a nice fabric like a mosaic, and a very colorful fabric that represents the energy demand of the Austrian municipalities. We have 2,100. And when you just move over the map, you see in the diagrams that the energy balances change, that the municipalities have different patterns of energy demand and energy supply, and of course you can quantify that. And what you can also do with this tool is to make regional energy balances and to get the starting point in any energy planning process very easily. And what is also, I think, very important is that when you add all the energy balances and greenhouse balances of all Austrian municipalities, you get the Austrian energy balance, 100% of it, or almost 100% of it. And so this is, I think, an interesting way also to use digitalization, digital tools to provide for planning data that can be used very early in the planning process, especially then when stakeholders form their interests and when local population, local decision makers should recognize that it is important to take climate action. So this is the first idea. Of course, we have to go deeper. We have to go have other levels of detail. And what we developed with the province of Styria was a program of integrated spatial and energy planning that is based on their climate strategy. And the main topic was to create a strategic database that allows for learning in planning processes, that allows for learning of planners and stakeholders and local decision makers to support the energy transition. And one of the key elements are of course energy balances, similar to those who you have seen in the energy mosaic and a bit more detailed, plus priority areas or suitability areas for district heating and for energy saving and environmentally friendly mobility, which means to identify these spatial structures that are walkable, bikeable, and equipped with public transport. Or, in other words, we try to find energy-efficient spatial structures. And in doing that, we want to support sustainable spatial development. And the main idea is to really, based on a model that we have developed at the Institute, is to zone or to show these areas as a part of an analysis that is forwarded to the municipalities, again for free, by the provincial government. And the municipalities can use this layer for their spatial planning activities. And the main idea is, of course, to have the further settlement development inside or in the close vicinity of these priority areas or suitability areas for district heating, because district heating is important for sector coupling. I will come to that later. And also for climate-friendly mobility, walking, biking, public transport. And of course, you can overlay these data and you get a clear picture of where a sustainable spatial development could take place. And because of the approach, it means that we also identify the areas that are walkable, that are bikeable, where you can organize your daily life easily. And so this is the second approach. And this is all embedded in a lot of governmental action by the provincial government. We have a legal implementation, we have a legal basis for these activities in the Provincial Spatial Planning Act. Municipalities are entitled to make integrated spatial and energy concepts as part of the local development strategy, but they must not do it. It's a possibility. If they want to do it, they can legalize the results of such a planning process. We provide the whole database for the whole province, for all municipalities. We have the planning methodology that is laid out in the planning guidance. And what is very important for me, we have created a further education program for spatial planners and municipalities. And accompanying that, the province of Styria came up with a subsidy scheme to subsidize municipalities who engage in such a planning process. They get 75% of the planning costs, up to a certain amount of money, but they have certain conditions. The first one is within 24 months, they have to show a legally binding implementation of the integrated spatial planning and energy planning process. They get additional funding for public participation, and there's one interesting feature. Only municipalities can apply if both the spatial planner and at least one representative of the municipality have participated in the further education program. So far, in Styria, we have 287 municipalities. About representatives of about 100 municipalities took part in the education program so far. All but one spatial planners took part in the further education program. We have about 40 applications or 40 municipalities at the moment working on these programs, on these integrated spatial and energy concepts, and the subsidy scheme is still ongoing. And of course, we have the database for all the municipalities of the province. At the moment, we are able to expand this approach to further municipalities, to further provinces, to Upper Austria and to Lower Austria. That means that with this approach, we will be able to cover 62% of all the Austrian municipalities, about 1,300 out of 2,100. But of course, as I said, spatial planning is a provincial matter. It means that we have different legal frameworks, and therefore we also have different planning guidances and different information needs for the provinces, for the municipalities and spatial planners in the provinces. That's what we are at the moment elaborating. And that brings me to the next step. When we think about renewable energy, we have to integrate volatile renewable energy sources into our energy system, replacing all fossil and also in Austria especially also all nuclear energy. I mean, we don't produce nuclear energy by ourselves. Anyhow. So what are we doing here? We are modeling in a high spatial and a high time resolution what is the energy demand of buildings in a certain area. What can be, in this case, it is solar PV, electricity produced on the rooftops of the buildings. This, of course, also works with solar thermal and can integrate different other energy sources in this area. What can be locally supplied? And what we see, this green line here on the top right corner in this graph represents 15-minute time slots of a year. It's the whole year, showing the energy demand of the buildings. And the blue columns represent the energy generation also in 15-minute time slots in the area if all the rooftops, suitable rooftops for PV, would be covered with PV cells and would supply electricity. What is very easily to understand is that normally never matches. Demand and supply normally don't match. And that means that we need grids and grid capacities, or we need storage capacities, or we have the possibility to transfer electricity to new uses we don't have yet, for instance, electric cars. What is very interesting, we have modeled that in different spatial archetypes. These are small to medium-sized towns, which means in Austria, not that large, small town in an international context. You have these different columns representing scenarios where 20, 40, 60, 80, and 100% of the suitable roofs in an area, it's now calculated for whole municipalities already, is equipped with electric PV panels. And what you can easily see in more urban scenarios, it is not possible to fully supply electricity, even if you cover all rooftops, without any demand saving. And when you take the right column, only about a third, 36%, up to 36% of the electricity produced can be directly used in the buildings below the roofs. 2/3 have to be dealt with differently because they are not produced when the energy is needed. We have this temporal gap. And that we can model very well nowadays. And we can do this, of course, also for rural areas. And what you see here on the right corner, only with PV, it would be possible to supply more, to produce excess energy, supply more than is needed in the municipality. And so you have a contribution to, for instance, urban energy scenarios. But also here, 42%, it's a bit more than in urbanized areas, 42% can be used directly. In other words, we have, when we compare energy demand and energy supply, we see that it doesn't match. If we produce excess energy, and we do that constantly, we have to think about how can we store it, how can we make it available for other uses, and which capacities do we need for storage, for grid, and so on. So let me come to the conclusions. First of all, I take up what I've said in the introductory note. Everything is connected like in a grid, like in this soccer goal grid. And integrated spatial and energy planning could be and can be a very powerful node in this grid to support sustainable spatial development. And use it as a backdoor, as a quantifiable backdoor to, for instance, also zone areas that are more suitable for sustainable development. Of course, we can do that also on a regional level, where you get a picture of where to organize settlement structures on a regional scale, where to organize central facilities, how you organize, for instance, transit-oriented development, but also where to leave out and protect open space for biodiversity, for agricultural forest production, and other land uses, open space land uses. What we have tried out here in this model, and I think this is an approach that works, is to deal with the strategicness of databases and of data that we can generate and provide to society. These strategic databases, of course, include scientifically provable facts. This is very important because there's a lot of perceived facts all around that are partly far away from what is scientifically provable. You have to, and this is also very important, just not provide the data, you have to include an analysis in the data provision, like you have the priority areas. We have been developing planning tools for more than 10 years in this field, and we found out that most of the tools are not really implemented. They are not really used in practice. Practitioners don't take them because you have to know a lot. You have to be very aware what the tool can do and cannot do, which questions it can answer or not answer in order to apply it. If you don't have the time, for instance, in the civil engineer's office to really dig into the functionalities of the tools and the logics of the tools, you don't start. So that's why we thought we provide the priority areas by ourselves for a whole municipality with a generalized model that is valid and that can be applied by everybody. It's also strategically relevant knowledge because we've put it on web pages and the knowledge is already there when the planning process starts. And I think this is also very important so that it can support social learning about values, support the negotiation of interests before the interests are finally decided by the stakeholders. Then people clash and interests clash. And you can also support the identification of impact. And of course, it's very important that this is available at the beginning or very early in the planning process. Time is, how much time do I still have? Not so much, 2 minutes, 1 minute, okay. So let's stop with the last slide about the didactics of integrated spatial and energy planning. I think it's very, very important if we perceive a planning process as a societal learning process, that we deal with the didactics of these planning processes. And I think there is a role of a kind of coach, learning coach or teacher, that is necessary to guide these actions, and this is not moderation or mediation, because it is not neutral. We have a goal. We have to advance climate protection. We have to advance the energy transition, both from an intrinsic motivation as planners, but also because we have to do it because of international policies, legal frameworks that are now more and more emerging. And so I think it's also important to perceive planning processes as learning cases and to deal with the didactics of integrated spatial and energy planning. It is really worth because we can support sustainable development as a whole, and it is quantifiable, it's easier to understand than other complex terms of planning, and therefore I think it's a very nice initiative and a very nice starting point, not only to protect the climate, but also to spur overall sustainable development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gernot. I think this was quite impressive. Do we have any immediate questions on this presentation? Kurt Hofstetter is here. Let's see if this works.
Thank you, Kurt Hofstetter. I'm leader of IBA Vienna, International Building Exhibition. Congratulations, I'm very much impressed by what you have done. I think it's even hard to understand how big this project is all over Austria and all the small communities. And what struck me most was when I saw your slide about, how did you call it, the energy efficient spatial structures. And what you listed is exactly what we are doing on urban development in many cases, but from a different perspective. So we are looking at social improvements, and we are looking at mobility improvements and economically. And it's exactly the same measures that are also from the energetical point of view, the ones that are really improving the situations. I think it's good to understand from different perspectives how things come together, and these are the main measures we have to really focus on to just cover a lot of improvements from different angles and perspectives. So thank you for this.
Thank you.
I think it was more a comment than a real question.
Maybe there's that. I think this is a very important point because it also shows the metaphor of the grid works actually, and I think this is really important. And what we also see in our studies is that when you look at urban areas, to promote the energy transition has to go more over the demand side and not so much over the supply side. Cities will have an energetic hinterland, if you want, rural areas, suburban areas that have to provide the energy for the cities, but they can be very energy efficient. I think what is also very important to understand is the importance of green space in the mix of functions. This is something that we have to consider more, I think, also in Vienna, and that also depends on the maximum densities that we are dealing with. And I think this is also a discussion that we have to more thoroughly enter. It's not only the question of what is the minimum density that we can apply in order to be efficient, but also what is the maximum density in order to cater for quality of life. Because also from an energetic perspective, if this is too low, it increases mobility, for instance. But overall, it decreases the quality of life. And this is something that we really have to think about.
Thank you very much. If there are any urgent questions,
one more question.
Wolfgang Rau. Something that struck me was when you showed how much energy it takes to provide single-family homes with infrastructure. And that reminded me to a central question that's hardly touched by in the technical area. That is, this infrastructure is incredibly expensive, and it will get more expensive in the future to sustain it. And how it's financed. It's subsidized to an incredible amount. This is an important thing. Your presentation was brilliant. Your work is brilliant, but it's no use if exactly the opposite has to be subsidized by the taxpayers. And as long as we don't shut this, defund these subsidies, it will continue.
Yeah. And we clearly have to say that when you look at the overall planning regulations and all what's happening around, that is both for integrated spatial and energy planning, but also for overall sustainable spatial planning. Economic incentives often go in different directions than what would be useful. And if we want to do the right things right, sometimes we are lacking the real regulations, because it also means that you have to enter the existing building stock and not only think about new buildings. And this is also very important, and we lack a lot of instruments in Austria and all over the places. I mean, also when you go to international literature, these topics are often discussed in a similar direction.
Thank you very much, Gernot, for impressive and inspiring presentation. As it was said now, as planners we might have the ideas and the solutions, but political decisions sometimes go into other directions. But still it's...
that's why I think we have to deal more with the didactics of planning.
Yeah.
Because when we know what the right things are, why don't the others know?
Yeah.
Why is it so hard to communicate that? Maybe we have the wrong attitudes to communicate our knowledge to society. But I think this is something that we really have to address. That's why I ended up with this didactic slide on didactics that you can maybe study in more detail after the conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much.